Welcome to the TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Gemini, and today is Saturday, December 3rd, 2011. We are looking forward to delving into intuitive ability, tarot reading, and dream interpretation with empath and intuitive Melodi Grundy this evening. Melodi joins us from rural Ireland, where she does personal consultations and readings from her office and by phone. You can learn more about Melodi by visiting her website, www.melodigrundy.wordpress.com. Melodi is also trained and certified by the Fellowship of the Spiral Path out of Berkeley, California, to aid others in seeking out their personal spiritual path by means of card, psychic questions, and guided meditations. Good evening, Melodi. We are looking forward to our show this evening and learning more about your intuitive gifts.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to this.
Thank you. For our listeners, this interview will offer insight into the world of tarot, dream interpretation, and the intuitive abilities that we can all tap into. Melodi has links to her card reading of the day, her reading schedule, and psychic fairs with free information and downloads at melodigrundy.wordpress.com. The WebBot forum administrator and producer of the show is Fox, and he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us this evening. Please welcome members Easy, Lua, Plane, and Uranus Rising. This interview will be available on YouTube and for free on the WebBot forum channel and at the website webbotforum.com. You may also find links to our interviews at Time Monk Radio Facebook page. We're going to begin this evening with some mini readings by Melodi. Are you ready to get started, Melodi?
Certainly. First, I'd like to say just a little bit about what it is I'm doing. Most of the time, I'm not actually reading classic tarot cards, but I read what are called oracle cards, or in the case of the cards I'll be using this evening, there's a deck called Psi Cards, which you can find out more about online. Just look up psicards.com. They were invented by Jungian psychologists, and the reason I really like them is because they have modern pictures on them. Many of them have similar motifs as the tarot cards, but not all of them. It's a slightly smaller deck, but the thing is they have cards like a card for work that just seems to be more accessible to modern people. I also use regular decks as well, but tonight mostly we'll be working with oracular decks. And that's what the other thing about the Psi cards is they've been nice enough to put them up online, which makes them very easy for me to show to people because I can link to them without having to take individual photographs of the cards. So that's another reason, a practical reason for using this deck. I was asked before the interview to look at a few things and explain what cards of the day are. Generally what I do, I used to do live readings on a radio show for Planet Stars, psychic service, and they no longer have a radio show. But when I was doing this a few years ago, I would do private readings for people. Well, not private, they'd be on the radio, but people would call and they'd ask about anything, their cat, their boyfriend, whatever. And the same cards would often come up for everybody on the show. Not every single card would be the same, but there would almost always be one card that would show up in almost every reading. And this happened week after week after week, and it tended to change. And I finally realized that what was probably happening is cards in general, or at least the way I read them, tend to be energies rather than sometimes they're facts, but usually a card is more describing the energy around a situation rather than the fact of the situation itself. Now, a good psychic intuitive may be able to figure out a fact from that, but in general, it's simply reading the energies. And I realized that every week things were changing, but they would usually be the same each week. And so there was always like one or two energies that seemed to be influencing everybody at the same time. And this could be a good thing like friendship or the sun, or it could be something like the card of destruction and death or whatever. And sometimes then too, if you looked at the headlines in the mainstream media, you would often see connections between what those energies were. I mean, if times were good and the card for money was coming up and it was booming, that would be in the paper. And if the cards were money and things were bad, that would be in the paper too. It was up to me to figure out how that interacted. But like, for example, about 3 years ago, I started getting lots and lots and lots of cards with economic problems in them. And that actually started to show up before the economic crash happened. And then once it did, I still repeatedly, even with private clients now, get that very often as interference. And we all know that's going on. You don't need a card to tell you that, but it's often reflected in the cards. Anyway, that's the background information. So I started doing something this summer called a card of the day, which is an attempt using 1 to maximum of 3 cards to read the energies on that day that are the most influential on at least the Western world, because I live in Europe and I have connections in North America, but it can be the whole world, but mostly it's the West. And taking off from that, I was asked to look at some issues for the future, which I'm going to put here, and I have linked on my website. You can go it's www.melodipsychicreadings.com, or the address she already gave you, and you can find it there. It's up on the front, and it'll say mini readings for the Time Monk interview up there, and just click on it. You can see these for yourself. But the first one I was asked to look at the energies for the year 2012. And as we all know, 2012 has a lot of stuff around it, especially the whole idea of, is it going to be the end of the world, or what did the Mayans say? My cards won't actually say anything about that exactly, but they may give us a clue to where some of the problems may come from. Now, I just pulled 3 random cards. And it just happens that the 3 we got, the first card is the prison, which is a prisoner sitting in shackles in a jail. That doesn't sound too good, and it actually isn't. The second card is the liar, which is a Joker figure who's dancing around holding a mask, and he's smiling on the mask, but the face behind him is grimacing, and there's a curtain with somebody behind it that he's trying to keep you from seeing. So he's not really a really good card either. He kind of means deception, lying, something is not as it seems. But the final card is really good. The final card is friendship, which is 3 friends sitting together having a drink. And they're having a really good time in a pub. These cards were made by someone in England, and for readers or listeners in North America, pubs in the UK are not like bars in the States. Pubs in the UK or Ireland are where you go to meet your friends. They're not necessarily where you just go to drink or dance. You could do that too, but they're more like a coffee shop in that sense. So anyway, this is really good. So what I have written is basically the cards for 2012 do not look very good, but they seem to involve entrapment, lies, and deceptions. But the major thing is that the problems in 2012, the good news is they seem to be related to things people do to other people, not to major earth changes or cosmic events that are beyond human control. And the good thing about this is because they are within human control, that means that there might be something possible that could be done about them. It also means that a person who's alert and prepared may be able to sort of deal with them, because people are something, even really mean people are something we sort of understand. The cards don't mean there won't be any natural disasters in 2012. There probably will be, but they don't show up in the cards, at least not at this time, as the major energy that people will be talking about, reading about, and dealing with. But falsehood and entrapment will be. And my reading of this is that friendship will be a very strong way, and one of the major ways that we can cope with this by relying on true friends and systems of community will be the best way to cope with this outward situation. So that's 2012. Now we get to 2013, which now, first off, because the cards read energies, the further away you get in time, the less likely the cards are to be accurate. This is not a get out of jail card free for the psychic. This is simply because I'm reading energies. And just like people could change the outcome in 2012, that doesn't mean they will. But because it's human caused, that's much easier to alter, which could alter some of what happens in 2013. But right now, the most likely future path seen in the cards is that the 3 major themes for 2012 will be the home, really good card in this case, cat on the mat, fire in the fireplace, tea on the table, really think cozy, wonderful cottage, and you've got the home. That's the good card. Unfortunately, the cards that follow it are maybe not so good, and they give us an indication of where the problems may be coming from. The two other main themes are the body, which represents the physical world, physical health. It's an illustration like from a 15th century manuscript of a body that's been almost dissected. We often call this the creepy card because it doesn't look really nice, but it's not necessarily a bad card, except that in this case, I think it means the body as human beings and the material world, and that's like right in the middle. And the final card is unfortunately destruction, which this does not mean, and I've got this written down the side, it does not mean, oh my goodness, we're all going to die. But it does suggest that there's going to be a lot of problems in 2013, that some of the major themes will be threats to the home, and the home can be your own home, it can be your nation, it can be the home even as Gaia, the world. And again, I don't think this is going to mean the world is going to be destroyed, but it means that we probably, if things don't change, there is the likelihood of great geological and natural problems such as earthquakes, tsunamis, and other things, possibly even famine. Things, if they're man-made, they're probably things like wars or other things that can cause a lot of destruction to the bodies of people. But again, but that home card, again, may be a clue as to how people can deal with that, because the home then becomes essentially a place of safety, a place of retreat, so that along with friendship and community, you have a direction there, but where you can look for things. So while things do not look so good for 2012, it looks to me like the year to really watch out for is 2013. And that's the first two mini readings that I had. And again, there are only 3 cards. One would have to do like probably 20 cards or more to get a really full reading, but that gives an idea of the 6 things to look for in the next 2 years, and people can go back to the website and refer to it. I'll just leave it up there, and we'll see how accurate the cards turn out to be.
All right, Melody, thank you. And just to follow up on that, how soon would you do a reading relative to 2013 where you feel like it could be more accurate since we're this far away from it?
Generally, now my husband and I also do, he's a rune master, and I'm learning the runes from him. Generally, we do a rune reading on around New Year's Eve, or sometimes in November as well, because that's basically some of the traditional Celtic New Year. So around much closer to the date, basically at the start of the year. Like, I feel that my cards are probably much more accurate for 2012, and with 2013, if things continue the way they are, they will be accurate for 2013. But I would really want to look at them again at the end of 2012.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I'd be interested in you sharing with us about your long and interesting history of training and explorations. For example, what traditions or methods you have trained in, including becoming a priestess, and how is it that you became involved with card reading as a means of divination?
Okay, well, very briefly, as a young child, I had a lot of memories of past lives and tended to see rainbows around things. Now, that's an interesting one, because when I was a little tiny child, I saw rainbows around everybody. And my mother, bless her soul, said they weren't there and they went away. So now I feel them, but I don't see them anymore, except sometimes in dreams. Now, she didn't know any better. She didn't see rainbows. This isn't her fault. But I think that's a really good indication of how adults can influence children and how we perceive the world. But I never really got a whole lot of the message. So until I was about 12 or 13, I had a lot of things going on. And I was interested in the paranormal and stuff. And then I went through a period as a teenager of being very involved in church and thought, okay, this is wrong. So I put it away for a while. And then I got to college and I started studying anthropology and history and realized that, maybe there, again, and I was also the sort of person that it didn't really go away. The things didn't stop just because I didn't want them to be there. So I went through sort of a period of being kind of agnostic, and then I got, actually, of all things, through reading science fiction and fantasy, I got very interested again. And through that, met a lot of people that were doing various forms of magic and divination and different things. And one thing kind of led to another. And when I moved from Mississippi to Denver, Colorado, I became involved I lived with some people for a while who practiced Wicca, and I studied Wicca with them for about 6 years. And that was when I had my first serious experience with card reading. I had a little bit of it when I went to school in Mississippi, but not very much. college, and then I moved to California and became involved with the Fellowship of the Spiral Path. The people I was living with were doing that. That was a sort of a big pagan organization that had a actual sort of a pagan seminary, and I was involved in that, studying both Wicca and later Asatru, which is basically Norse traditions, and that's mostly what I practice now. But I had things like, as part of my training, I was a high priestess in a coven in the Castro, where it was mostly gay men during the height of the AIDS crisis. So I did an awful lot of work with trance and death and passages and crossing. And again, I found that things like cards and other forms of divination, specifically a lot of trance work, were extremely useful for people who were in the process of crossing over, and both in helping them and to cross themselves, and maybe helping to understand for myself what was happening. On the other hand, ever since I was a young child, I was also very interested in a man called Edgar Cayce, who was known in the 1930s as the sleeping prophet, who did a lot of writing in the U.S., and he was someone who would go into trance, and he would talk about healing and things, and also people's past lives. And he didn't remember any of it usually when he was awake. He had to be told what he said. But I think Edgar Cayce has also been a tremendous influence in how I view the world and how I view the other world, as well as, say, I personally find that the Norse, the sort of Viking cosmology of Freyr and Freya, and Odin and Thor, to be very useful to me. But I'm also, I think that that's been sort of a part of a long process. And I think the major thing for people is that it's helpful to have some sort of system, whether that's Buddhism, whether it's metaphysical Christianity, or whether it's Norse, being Asatru. It just sort of helps you put a framework on it.
Sure. Okay. Well, next up we have Plain.
Hi. Could you describe your understanding of the history of runes and the tarot or other related cards? And might these be residual items from a high civilization in the past?
Okay, first the runes. My husband would be much better at this than me because he has a PhD from Cambridge in Old Norse studies.
In runology?
And no, actually he did his dissertation on Odin, god of death. And his specialty was Viking religious motifs, especially in terms of death. And he did study the runes in relation, because the runes were believed to have been brought by Odin to the world. And he actually speaks Old Norse and can translate Icelandic and all this. But the Cliff Notes version from him is basically that we don't know exactly when the modern runes came in. There are some of them that seem to be influenced by the Latin alphabet from Rome. The idea of writing probably came indirectly from Rome. But once again, there's these two issues. There's the actual physical history. By the Viking age, they are definitely be used as a form of writing. Vikings turn out, or Northmen as they call themselves, turned out to have been highly literate. There's a find in Russia. There's a city that they found that's been sort of buried in the mud, where there's just thousands of letters that they may be 100 years translating. That's just average people writing to each other. So the runes were definitely an alphabet by 900, 1000. What we don't know is, were they being used as a form of divination? Historically, my feeling is probably they were, because the alphabet itself has almost always been used as some form of divination, because letters are kind of magic. But we don't have any proof of it being used until the sort of 19th century, almost Nordic revival that happens in Scandinavia. But there's no doubt that runes mean specific things, because we have very ancient poems, at least 1,000 to 1,500 years old, that talk about the runes and what they symbolize. So you can take those runes and you can use those symbols and use the 24 runes of the Futhark to use as divination. Is that historical or not? We don't know, but it does seem to work. The tarot I actually had to look up this week because I wasn't sure myself. And the tarot seems to be, originally it was 14th century playing cards, very much like the runes being an alphabet. Again, there's no direct evidence of them being used in the Middle Ages for divination, but by the 18th century, they start being used as divination, and they start becoming more codified and more the same. But they really, really seem to have been formed as a modern system in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they formed the basis of the modern tarot today. Residual from items from a high civilization, I would think, especially in the case of tarot cards, and to a lesser degree the case of the runes, probably not, except in the sense that divination, and I have this in my notes, is of all sorts, including astrology, probably is that old, or various forms of it, maybe not modern astrology, but the idea of looking at the stars for guidance. Trance work, probably, we see evidence of that on the cave paintings like 38,000, 40,000 years ago. Things like dowsing for water, pendulums, or looking into water, those probably go back as long as people have been upright and looking at the world around them and the other world, sleep dreaming and trance work. So tarot and runes, maybe not, but the other stuff, certainly.
Well, Joseph Farrell's book, one of his books recently, makes the case that the I Ching has a lot of aspects of some residual element that might be many, many thousands of years old. So I suspect there's a lot that we just don't know. That's all you can say. By the way, a different question would be, have you had any changes in how you read things over the years? Are the impressions different, or perhaps your techniques, or how you approach things?
Just one comment on the I Ching. That would not surprise me, because China's civilization, if you go back 5,000 years, it seems you get the same motifs. It's very unusual in that part of the world, even from mundane anthropology. Things go back many thousands of years, so that wouldn't surprise me, at least. And I don't know much about the I Ching. But getting back to your question, yes, I would say that my techniques have changed quite a bit, although it's more like an adding of things rather than a change of perspective. I started out doing mostly trance work, learning to do past life for a group of friends, meditating, guided meditations, and dream interpretation. And then about 25 years ago, when I got to Denver, I also picked up the side cards for the first time, and I felt a real connection to the side cards, which were then a new deck. And then when I got to California, I started doing some basic runes and things as part of the spiral training. I only got really serious about the runes this past year, but as part of a priestess training, we had to learn all kinds of divination, and each time you learn something else, like whether it's working with a pendulum on a map or scrying in a bowl of water, you tend to get, I don't think it adds to what you can do, and you may find I find that certain techniques work better for different kinds of questions, or perhaps at different stages or periods of my life. So that's what I would say on that.
Any rough explanation of when you would choose one versus another? Say, when would you use a pendulum, for example?
Okay, I use a pendulum for two things. In California, we were using it working with maps, because we were trying to find out what areas had traditional land spirits or certain energy points, which might have been sort of graveled over by the modern city. And like, for example, we walked around and found an influence of water with the pendulum on the place we were living, and then got maps and discovered that there was actually a river that ran under our house, which later flooded. And things like that. So you can use it that way. I use the pendulum now, recently. I use it with cards, because when I'm reading for clients, because I'm not the sort of psychic that easily picks up dates or timelines from the air, but I've discovered I can hold the pendulum over the cards and just ask things like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and often get fairly accurate answers. Now, with that particular type of pendulum work, I probably am unconsciously influencing the pendulum, but I have to trust that my unconscious is doing that in such a way as to get the right answer. I can't bring it consciously out of my mind. But some of the other things like dowsing, which I've only done once, there was an old Irish dowser that came to visit, and he handed me his tools, and they just took off, and I was scared to death. I have to tell you, it was like something totally outside myself. That's a different sort of thing altogether, but that's where it's like it sort of takes over you. But the pendulum, I think, is really useful for working with maps or working to answer questions. Other people use them to in healing techniques to find out where somebody's maybe affected by an illness, but I've never tried that myself.
Okay, thanks. Well,
sure.
Here's another question from Gemini.
Hi, Melody. I'm curious to know how you would describe the energy of the flow of the tarot reading between the reader, the subject, and the universe.
Okay, the cards, in the hands of a good psychic, cards or any other divination tool for that matter is a focus. You're using that card or the bowl of water or whatever you're using to tap into the flow of energies that are affecting the client and are out in the universe in general, hence the whole card of the day, or even looking into a bowl of water to see the stream of time to try to predict the future. It's not the card and it's not the bowl of water. It is making that connection, and they're just sort of, you just sort of have to trust. I mean, there may or may not be something like the great collective unconscious, like Jung wrote about, but there's definitely something out there that people can tap into. And some people do it naturally easier than others, but I believe that anybody can be trained to tap into it to some degree, and that for everybody is going to do it a little bit differently.
Okay, and just to follow up a little bit, in the introduction, you had said that you had been reading cards for people and then you kept getting the same card over and over. Do you feel like that perhaps that's your energy influencing the cards? Do you find that that ever happens?
Yes, and that's why I tend to do things like I have 3 different decks of psi cards that I will interchange, because it is totally possible for a deck to get what I call stuck, which whether I'm doing it or the deck is doing it, it just or unconsciously the paper is getting rattled to where you feel a different place. The other thing is usually if I'm getting stuck, it becomes rather obvious, or sometimes the client gets stuck. I get this a lot, excuse me, in readings where somebody really, really wants something, like a young girl really, really wants a particular boyfriend, and she just keeps asking the same questions over and over again. And in the beginning, it may be very negative, but it later becomes kind of positive. And really what's happening is she so wants this to happen that she's influencing the cards. And, maybe she'll be influencing reality too, but at the moment, she's just influencing the cards. And if I feel like I'm getting in the way of a reading, I have 2 choices. I can either back off and tell the person, look, I'm sorry, this isn't working today. Let's try it again later. Or the first thing I'll do is to switch decks or even switch techniques so that I'm changing the focus, and hopefully that will allow the energy to flow better.
Okay, thank you for that. And next up, we have Plain.
Yeah, I know you use different types of cards, and how do you know when to use what type of card? Are there pros and cons of some decks over the others, or is it a matter of the question that you're dealing with, or is it a type of spread, or?
The answer to that is yes, which I don't mean to be funny there, but it is definitely, the question really answers itself, in that the different kinds of decks, different decks are slanted in different ways, and they tend to have different artwork, different energies, and they work much better for different types of questions. For example, the psi cards are lovely, but they're a rather modern deck. They're perfect for reading about real-time problems like jobs, career, again, boyfriends, that kind of thing. And the psychic tarot deck, which I really like, is very similar, but it's a much larger deck. It's also modern with beautiful pictures on it, but it's got 7 chakra cards in it. It's not a classic tarot, and it's really good for like spiritual path readings if somebody wants to know, like, or if they want to know about their past lives, or their karma. Those become more choices, and they're just more, I call them cosmic. I know it sounds kind of hippie, but they're a very cosmic set of cards, and I use them for a lot of the more complex readings. Also, they have like 4 or 5 different cards for different types of love affairs or love, which there's only 1 card in the psi card deck. So if someone's got an intricate question about their soulmate, that may be a better deck to use. Animal decks are really good for pet readings. They're also good for people wanting to look for their power animal or working with the energy of a particular animal or ally. Most decks can be used for spirit guides or information from the parted, or information from spirit. But again, some work better than others for particular questions. Now, the traditional tarot is a more rigid system, and it's got really rigid answers. Except again, good readers can use it as a focus as well. But it's very good for very structured readings, and it's also good for when you want to get some distance. because the old-fashioned illustrations actually create a sort of distance for you and the client, which sometimes you may need, as opposed to the more modern oracular decks that really pull you in to the card, but may sometimes be distracting. Different types of spreads definitely make a difference. I generally use for full readings, it's a variant of an old-fashioned style called the Celtic Cross that my first card teacher in Mississippi showed me, and it works really well for full general readings. But if I have a tighter question, I may use 1 card, 3 cards, 7 cards. There's also a way that you can, like, if you person has 2 questions, they have 2 possibilities. They can move to Denver or they can move to Atlanta, but they can't do both. I'll do 2 different complete readings for them, or 2 different 7 cards, but they won't tell me which way is which. And that way I don't know, and I can't influence it, but they tell me afterwards, usually, because I like to know, but they get the energies around each move so they can have a better information on making a decision which one is better for them. And whether we did a 7 card reading or a full reading would depend on the situation and how much information they needed.
And how about with runes? When do you use or recommend them?
They work really well because they tend to be like powers like ice and fire and different things like that, birch tree. They work very well with traditional questions that we think they were probably used for, or at least we know the Doors divination of various types was used for, which was like predicting the weather, so weather changes, the harvest, earth changes like volcanoes. There's a rune that's basically the need fire. So when things are really, if things are desperate or you really need to know something, they're very good. Possible economic problems are good for readings if you want, if there's going to be a war. We tend to ask questions on New Year's, like, what is the situations we're most likely facing in the new year? So, like, where will things be coming from? Will it be a solar problem, or will it be maybe economic? Or this year we got floods. There's a rune basically that signifies flooding, and we got that, which we were expecting ice and snow, and we got floods instead. So you never know what you're going to come up with. They're also good for some spiritual path readings. And I've actually used them sometimes helping people find their animal spirits, because again, they're very traditional things, and there are some animals, though definitely not all, but there's some Northern European animals that are connected with them. I like to use runes for the great and hard to know questions like climate change or a pending war. So that's basically what they're best for, I think.
As a hypothetical question, let's say someone asked you the same questions as he would ask your husband. Would the answers tend to be similar, assuming you hadn't talked about it, right?
Very often, though, we read runes very differently, interestingly enough. As he says, I read runes more like I read cards. I read the imagery from them. And often, one thing he noticed, he wanted me to start reading them, because even before I was seriously studying them, I would pick up things from the rune the way I would pick it up from the cards. Now I'm trying to get all of the serious background information and learn it by heart as well, so I have that to influence. But interestingly enough, sometimes we do come up with very similar answers, but we do it in a roundabout way, different ways.
Okay, thanks. Next up is Easy.
Hello, Melody. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Great. Just a thought came with Plains runes questions. Do different sections of the country or the world are they more inclined to do runes versus cards? I.e., is Ireland more runes interest, or is it more cards interest, or is there a difference? Do you notice people tending towards one or the other?
In general, that's a really good question. And in general, people tend towards cards in most places. The reason being, or if they want to know about, if they're asking about runes, like in Ireland, they'll ask you if you can do Om, which is sometimes mispronounced Agam, because there's a whole, I guess, metaphysical bookshop sets of supposedly Om runes, which historically, again, probably never existed, but people believe they do. And there was a system of Celtic trees, and these often get called the Celtic runes. And people here do use them, and they're quite popular. Again, even if they were invented in 1975, it doesn't really matter, because if they work for people as a focus, they're working. But people honestly believe that they're working an ancient old system, which they probably aren't. But again, the trees and the ohm figures are real. They definitely are very ancient. So they're just taking an ancient technique, but they would call those the runes. What I'm referring to is the runes, or what my husband says properly, rune staves, are a specifically Germanic Norse technique, which were made popular in the States by somebody in the 1970s who, again, wrote a book where a certain amount of it is, shall we say, kind of not historically accurate, but it got certain people interested in them, and people have studied them. But by and large, I find most people are much more aware of cards in both places. Now, if you were to go to China or the Orient or even Chinatown, you'd probably get a lot more people interested in the I Ching or one of the Eastern methods of divination. But I would say cards, most places, both in and it goes in cycles, because like in the 1980s, when I lived in Denver, channeling was a really big thing, and people would have parties almost in their living rooms and have invited channeler, and they would bring forth an entity or supposedly a deity or spirit, and they would use their voice and talk to them. Very similar to old-fashioned mediumship. In the 19th century, spiritualism and mediumship was very, very popular and was used in very much the same way. And it never completely went away. But I'd say more people are interested. I think a lot of people find cards the same way I do. It's a very safe way to approach the unknown. You're not likely to get in a whole lot of trouble with them.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
One more question, if I could, please.
Sure.
The card of the day. The card of the days have been fascinating since you started doing that, and particularly now I'm expecting the same card to come up. So when it doesn't happen, I'm always shocked. And did you expect that did you have any expectations when you started doing the card of the day? And what is the question you ask before you do the card of the day?
Let me answer that one first. The first thing I do when I do card of the day is I do a little bit of a breathing exercise for a couple of seconds. And then, because I am mainly a follower of the Norse traditions, I ask Freya, who is the goddess who is in charge of divination, one of the goddesses in charge of divination, she wears a falcon cloak, and I ask her kind of to put her falcon cloak around me and give me guidance. Now, anybody doing something like this, you could use whatever spiritual path you find comfortable, but basically I ask for divine guidance in doing it. Okay, and then the question I normally ask is, what is the most important energy for the next 24 hours for either the world or the Western Hemisphere? And 90% of the time, the mental image I have, I think in pictures a lot, is of a map of the globe with North America and Europe in front. And I repeat this several times a week, because I know if I were living in Australia or living in Japan, I would have a different focus. Now, sometimes I pick things up, like there have been a few times that I've just overwhelmingly known that something was about Fukushima or some other part of the world, and that will stand out very clearly. But most of the time, I want to know what the main energy is, or energies that are really going to be at play in the next 24 to 48 hours. Oh, and sorry, and as for the repeat, sorry, I almost forgot about that. The repeat, I did not know they would repeat as much as they have. There are actually 40 cards in the deck. My original expectation for starting the card of the day was just to show off a little mini reading for my reading business. And then it got to be so interesting and so intense, and I felt so involved in particularly connecting the cards and the energies to world events that it just sort of took off on a life of its own. I'm not shocked by the fact that they come up the same, because what really does surprise even me sometimes, although it repeatedly happens, is in a personal reading for a client, you'll ask, the same cards will show up 4 or 5 times, even if we change decks to completely different decks. We use the Psychic Tarot and the Psy cards and maybe even the runes, and we're getting the same energies coming up, and even the client can see it, And it's not even that we're asking identical questions, but it's just those are the main energies in their life right now. And going back to the old radio show, those cards of those what I called the cards of the week at that point, because I was doing a weekly show. It was obvious that the same energies, like say the moon or work or or the lover's card. Seem to be influencing nearly everybody in a particular way. What has surprised me about the card of the day is the consistency with particularly the worldwide readings. But again, if we look at the current headlines for I started this like in August, I went back and looked it up. The major stories have been about economics and conflict. And I think the cards are just picking that up. It'll be interesting to see if we get beyond this particular rocky period with economics, if they'll change again. Because there are, as I tell my clients, there are other cards in this deck. They're just not showing up. And even if I change decks or if I change the way I shuffle them or I have other people pick them, they don't change.
They don't. It's just fascinating. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Easy. Melody, we're going to move on to the topic of the unseen world, and Uranus Rising has a question next.
Hi, Melody. I found the first chapter of your book, Beginner's Guide to the Unseen World, very informative. You have a real gift for staying grounded while exploring and explaining the unseen world. Would you share with us what this book is about, what you mean by the unseen world, and what you hope to offer readers? And, of course, when it might be available, because I want to get my hands on it.
Okay. Well, for to answer the availability question first, I started it about 5 years ago and then put it aside and have picked it back up again. And my husband is helping me with it. He's got some other projects. He's a professional writer, among other things. And we hope to get it out in the spring if we can. Part of the issue is we're trying to decide if we want to break it down because the first chapter is 17 pages long, the one that people can get for free by going to my website and downloading. That's still an only partially edited version. So yes, I know there are some, it's not necessarily the way it's finally going to be, but you can get a sense of what the book will be like by going there. So we may put it out as one large book or several smaller ones, but hopefully in the spring for the first installment. Basically what it is, it's an introduction to the most common questions and situations that I've noticed in about 30 years of working with people, particularly the special problems that come in when people first start exploring or the unseen world or, as I say in the book, the unseen world comes looking for them. Because basically I found over the years there are two kinds of people who get involved in, for lack of a better term, metaphysics. Metaphysics as defined in its more modern sense and not its traditional Greek one, but just metaphysics being the unseen world and the study of it, for lack of a better term. But pretty much what happens is some people get interested through reading books and they're intellectually interested in it and they sort of have to go looking for it. And so there's that type of reader that I know will pick the book up. But then there's also lots of people that they're there because the unseen has come looking for them, whether they want it there or not. And, you know, it's like, I just had a client like that recently, and, you know, she's a wonderful young woman, and she's like, you know, how do I stop it? and it's not that people want it to totally go away. It's that they want to know, like, when you're cooking dinner is not necessarily when you want to be seeing the future. It just isn't. Or when you're like working the photocopier at work, you know, it's because that kind of thing can and do transcend people, particularly that are untrained but are susceptible to it. It's repeating over and over again, and you got the photocopier going, and suddenly, oh my goodness, you're singing from the Colosseum in Rome. Maybe I don't want to be doing this. So it's like how it's that kind of thing, or other people who are sensitive to, say, maybe ghosts or other things. They don't know how to shut it out. So it's a book that is designed to be very, very, very basic and doesn't assume that you know anything. And some of it, the part of what I'm having interest doing right now is trying to document some of the things, because I kind of wrote it a stream of consciousness, but a lot of it comes from various books. Some of it's just my own opinion. For example, I have some opinions on what I think ghosts are, and that's more than one thing, and that will be in later chapters of the book. I mentioned that's my own theory, though it's usually based on observations other people have made. Again, hopefully it'll be done soon-ish, and it probably will wind up being more than one book, because we don't want to overwhelm people. But one of the major things we want to do in the book is tell people how they can safely explore things from a position where they feel comfortable. And also another thing I point out is not to push people. Even if you're experiencing things that are really incredible, if somebody isn't ready to hear about something, then sometimes it's just better to leave them alone. So it's a whole lot of things, but it's basically, it's psychic exploration 101.
Yeah, and I think it's so necessary right now. And I love how you start at the basics, just assuming people don't know anything. But even if you do know something, I thought it was very well written, and I liked your observations. But one of the things that I think is important, you touched on it, is you talked about it in this first chapter, how to psychically protect oneself. And I wondered if you could tell us briefly here how to do this, and just as importantly, why we need to do this. Who and what do we need to protect ourselves from?
Again, answering that part first, that's a very, very good question. When people start looking at things in the unseen world or things beyond themselves, or even if they're not actively looking, but they start having dreams and things, they start experiencing things. It's sort of like, as one of my teachers described it, a light bulb goes out on the astral or on the unseen world. And this light bulb attracts every moth and every little thing that may be out there. Now, by things, we can call them just, you can think of them as spirits, you can think of them as imps, you can think of them as, demi-fae, you can put all kinds of names on them, but they do definitely seem to be out there. And some of them are really friendly and you really do want them around. We could class these kind of like guardian angels or guardian spirits, friendly, even just sort of friendly sprites, whatever. But there's also a lot of things that like sort of feed off energy, and they may actually make you feel kind of drained and unhappy and grumpy, and some of them actually are probably doing this on. Some of them maybe actually, if you use lack of a better term, evil. Those are rare, but they do exist. But you get, most often it's just things that kind of, they're just going to kind of like, they see this bright light and they want some of it, so they're just kind of seem to be sucking it away. And you don't really want those in your life, and also particularly when you're first learning, it's really hard to tell the difference, or you're not even sure they're there. So to prevent shall we say, interactions with things that you'd rather not interact with, or at least not want to interact with without knowing that it's going on, you want to do things to psychically protect yourself. And a lot of people do this naturally if they were experiencing a lot of things as children, but if they don't have a conscious control over it, it can become difficult to take it on and off like a coat, and you want to be able to do that. Yeah. And the best way to psychically protect yourself, the easiest exercise, and one reason I put the first chapter out there for free, is because people need this information. I have like about 3 exercises in there that I was taught early on, variants of them to do, but the easiest one that people write about is just the whole thing of the white light. Imagine yourself in a white light. But I find that people a lot of times need more direction than that. And you can, instead of just the white light, you think of yourself as being inside of an egg. And you think of the egg, and you could pretend. It's like a let's pretend game the children play. You just shut your eyes and you pretend that there is an egg around you, and it's under your feet and it's on top of your head, and you're the baby chicken. And you'll sound really silly, but no one's going to watch you. No one's going to see you. You're doing this by yourself. And then you think of the eggshell around you. And you can think of the eggshell as being white and light and protective. And it's sort of like just a barrier between you and other stuff. And you can make it look transparent. You can pretend it so you can see out of it. You don't want to be blocked completely, but you just want to keep things out that you don't want there. And that's probably, the egg is probably the most basic of the exercises. And I just find a lot of people find eggs easier to relate to than just think of a white light. Although that does work for some people. There's nothing wrong with that, but it just it gives you a focus for that light. And then there's a lot of things you can go from there, and a lot of the book will be further exercises at the end of each chapter for people for each step of the way.
Well, Melody, I just think this is so important. As the energies change, I think we need to get this information out. So I really, really appreciate what you're doing. Thank you very much.
Yes, one more quick thing on that and the energies of the day. Another good use of psychic self-protection is that if you know that the energies of the day are particularly just bad, and there are a few cards that are mostly bad, like say destruction, you can use that to try to shield yourself from those energies and then concentrate on other ones.
Yeah, great point. That's wonderful. Thanks.
You're welcome.
We are speaking with Melodi Grundy. You can learn more about Melodi and her work by visiting her website, www.melodigrundy.wordpress.com, and that's Melodi, M-E-L-O-D-I, Grundy, G-R-U-N-D-Y, wordpress.com. We're moving on to the subject, the wall and the war, and Uranus rising. has the next question.
Melody, a lot of remote viewers and psychics cannot view anything beyond sometime during 2012. Cliff High has said that the WebBot data drops to 1% of previous quantity in March of 2012 and then disappears entirely in May of 2013. Would you tell us about your dream of the wall? What do you make of it? And how does your dream relate or connect to what other psychics have seen for this time and Cliff's work too?
Okay, well, first off, my dream did not have a date on it. However, I have always had a feeling that there's always been a certain block of time beyond which I could not seem to see. And that goes back to the 1980s. And I usually called that the wall. And one of the other things that I'm trained in doing that I don't do professionally as a psychic, but I do perform as a priestess, is I'm trained to what's called Norse spay work or spell work, which is where you go in and you sit in a chair. It was called a high seat. There's a description of this in Greenland where the seeress goes and she sits in a high seat and she goes into trance and they ask her questions like, what of the harvest? And she brings back information on whether the harvest will be good or bad that year, which is incredibly important if you are living in a traditional society in Iceland around 1000. So in any case, I'm trained to do this. And in this dream, which I had about probably 12, 13 years ago now, I have it written down somewhere. I think it's, but I'm not exactly, anyway, it's been a while. In the dream, it's incredibly real. And I fall asleep and yet I'm wide awake. But then I see my chair and I go and I sit in my trance chair. And in the dream, I go into trance. And I say to myself, okay, I know I'm dreaming and I am now in spay trance. I'm going to find out about the wall. I have my own question. I want to know, dang it, what is on the other side of that wall? And that's pretty much what I said.
Yeah.
And okay. And so in trance, my astral body, I get up and I walk. And I see this, what appears to be this either giant sliding glass door or a window. And it's very dark outside. I can see outside, but it's like completely black. And then it starts to fall and it looks first like snow. In fact, I'm sure it is snow. And then it turns to ash. And that's all I can see. And I'm going, I want more. I need information. And I'm actually pounding on the door or the window with my fists. And I'm just pounding like a little kid, just mad. And then suddenly it's like poof, everything goes poof. And I'm in like an 1880s farmhouse bedroom. It's like I live in Ireland, but this feels more like somewhere in the plains of the United States, like Iowa or something. And I'm upstairs in the bedroom. I know I'm very old because I look and I can see age spots on my hand. And although the room has a nice bed cover on it and it's clean, there's a bathroom off of it, but it's like a porta potty. And I just know because it's one of those things where it's one of those dreams where you know many things because you're already there. It's not you're thinking about it. It's just the way life is. And there's a porta potty that somebody will empty because I'm very old and I can't get to the outhouse.
Yeah.
And there's a kitchen downstairs, and for some reason I begin creaking my way down to the kitchen. And I get to the kitchen, and there's other family members there who I don't recognize all that well, but I do in the dream. And it's very 1880s, sort of 1860s, 1880s with the wood stove and gadgets, but no power. And there is, and then a young woman comes running in shouting, "The rain is coming! The rain is here! It's over! It's finally over!" And everybody goes dancing into the yard. And it's this kind of dusty, dry, 1880s style farmyard from the Midwest with rain, but rain is starting to come down, and people just start dancing. And the young girl is particularly dancing, and I know that she's my granddaughter. Now that's very interesting because I can't have children in this lifetime. So the only way she has to either be a symbol for a generational thing, because I had this dream maybe around 1995. So, generations in terms of that length of time. Or perhaps if this dream is closer to an actual something that will happen to me or to the person that I had sort of entered their space, it would have to be adopted. it would have to be like an adoption of somebody, which might happen if things got very bad. But in either case, so we're thinking and I'm very old, and when I had the dream, I was in my 40s. So we're probably looking like 30 to 40 years later. From the age I seem to be. And I remember thinking as I'm rushing outside and I start to dance, wow, I shouldn't be doing this because I'm too old for this, but I'm doing it anyway, because it's like so exciting that whatever it is, it's finally breaking and finally over. The dream goes on a little bit further. I wind up then walking down a laneway, and I'm caught up in I lay down and I'm caught up in this river, and I think, oh, they'll find me, but who cares? Basically, I probably pass away. But there's another little twist there that I almost never mention, and that I wake up and I'm back in the farmhouse again, and I start to panic because it all feels so real, and I know I'm dreaming and I can't get out, and I start hitting on things, and then a voice says, remember your training, and I wind up crossing my arms like you see an Egyptian mummy, which I've never been trained that way in this lifetime, and I fall backwards and I wake up in bed. So that was almost like getting stuck in a which makes me think that part of what I was seeing was almost a future recording of what might be. But I think that the whole 1880s thing then was reinforced later in the day. The same day I had the dream, I was telling my husband about it. I went and I was listening to an interview on I think National Public Radio with a historian on the internet, and he was saying that it was about, I don't know what, but he was saying, yes, the 1880s, that's when the modern world totally begins, because that's when you before then you don't have light bulbs, you don't have serious telegraphs, you don't have serious telephones, and it was that line that it was like I got shivers when I heard that. That's when the modern world starts, the 1880s. So that's why I put that date on it, because many of the things in it looked that way.
Sounds very synchronistic.
Yeah, and I really felt like sometimes I think that the universe does that. It gives you hear something very strongly because it fits. And it stays with you. So, but so anyway, that's the basic dream, and my personal interpretation of it is that, again, whatever it is that we are facing, or that the world is facing, that creates the wall that many, not necessarily all, but many psychics and remote viewers turn into. It has to be either so different from anything we can comprehend, possibly so terrible, or possibly something that hasn't been decided. It's got to be one of those three, but my suggestion is probably the first two, that we just can't get our minds around it. We can't see it, except that there's snow and there's ash. Those are clues. They're not clues that I'm comfortable looking very closely at, but it's kind of disturbing. But in the long run, we're okay, and actually that fits with, I know a number of psychics that I've read there that are more futurists than I am, and they often, if they can't see immediately in the 21st century, but they see further out, like 2050, 2060, and what they tend to see is people living in small rural communities, or under glass domes or something, which there was no glass dome in my dream, but there was, again, this sense of rural community and a return to largely to farming life. Family life.
Has any of this changed your understanding of it over time, especially working with your husband's runes?
Well, I'd say the major things that I think now, from when I was in the 1980s, when I first started having premonitions of something, I used to put it in the context of the time, like wonder, was this going to be like a big nuclear war or something? And I even had a few dreams about that sort of thing, so that may happen as well. But I think it's probably, whatever the wall is probably a worldwide rather than a US-based event. It's not an extinction level event, because I think that's the message of almost every dream I've had. There is life afterwards. It's just different.
Right.
I had one in the 1980s where, we were living in a community, and someone came riding into town wanting taxes on horseback, and they said, the president of the United States declares that we're here to collect his taxes, and someone yells from the back, who is it this week?
Okay.
And then grabs them and pulls them down because we don't want anybody shot, I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy, so that may be where that came from. But it's that kind of thing that there's always, particularly the very strong, what I call the wall dream. There is life afterwards, but it's rather harsh for a long time. But there may be and I also think that it may or may not be one great event. You know, it may be, from what my husband has come up with the runes, it may be a series of events rather than one giant event, or perhaps a series of events that lead up to larger one that kind of kicks things over. But again, end of the world, I don't think so. But end of life as we know it right now, very possibly.
Yeah, that sounds like it fits. Are there any psychics that you know of that can see anything beyond this wall?
Oh, I think lots of people see beyond the wall, but they just see much further. Now, to my knowledge, and John Hogue I've suggested you might want to have him on this program sometime. He's a self-taught Nostradamus scholar and personal psychic as well that I respect a great deal. And he's another very level-headed person and probably been a really big influence on me. Nostradamus doesn't talk about a wall. What he does, from what John can see, and John reads the medieval French and the Latin and all of the languages you need to know to be able to try to figure Nostradamus out. But he does talk about some really horrific wars and famines and just really awful stuff that sound like they come around anywhere from from this period to the 2020s.
Yeah.
And astrologically, that's when they would date using his astrological system. So, again, along with the snow and the ash, that I kind of wondered if that was like a symbol for climate problems and war, which would fit with what Nostradamus has. He has great famines and great dryness in some places, and great other great amounts of water in others. And but his website, I think, is johnhugprophecy.org or something. But you can find him by looking him up on the internet. He's really brilliant, and he will answer his email.
Wow, great! That's good information. Thank you, Melody.
Sure.
But this begins to make a bit of sense that this wall, this period, we don't know what it is, but it's something big, and it's obscured. So that's quite interesting. Well, thank you for that. I'll pass it over to Plain now.
Yeah, I've got a question from forum member Green Meadow. You've talked about the possibility of another great war. So could you tell us what you see, how this is being revealed to you, and perhaps what input the runes had on this impression?
Okay, this has come in two ways. One, like John Hogue, I previously mentioned, I pay a great deal of attention to current events, and I'm very interested in, I'm basically a news hound from way back, addicted to news channels and that sort of thing. So there is the mundane level on which I can see the puzzle pieces, as someone with a degree in history, the puzzle pieces coming together. Now, that's not psychic. That's just putting things together in a way that makes sense. On the other hand, my husband we were doing the rune reading for what do we expect this year, and we were just actually doing this on October 31st, which is the Celtic New Year, since we live in Ireland. And interestingly enough, in the previous years, we've seen economic possibilities or problems not affecting us as badly, but affecting the world, which has happened. He's seen, possible solar stuff when the sun got really active. But this time, he saw the runes and unfortunately he's been suffering from a bad toothache, so I just have not been able to, he hasn't been able to do a follow-up reading for the show. But basically, just trust me, the runes were like everything you would expect to see if the great puzzle pieces were coming together for a great war. And that's what he called it. He said, it looks to me like it's built, he said, it feels like, the energy around, like when you read about before World War I, really World War I more than World War II, where the nations of the world are just kind of putting their pieces together. And it was really a surprise because we weren't really expecting to see it in the exact runes. I think I may have mentioned them on the day afterwards in the WebBot forum, and I may be able to put that up on the website. I'm really apologize that that's the one thing I did not get back to look up before the interview, so it's not in my notes. I actually have here, go look it up, and I didn't. But basically, that's where that came from. And since he did that rune reading, we've been also noticing on the cards of the day that there seems to be, along with economic stuff, that there was a great decision, a puzzle that came up several times when I first started reading the cards in August that we didn't know what it was. And then suddenly it appeared that puzzle had been decided. The puzzle being a decision and being made behind the scenes and was being lied about. And my serious gut feeling now is that decision was that decision on the part of whoever ultimately thinks they control these things that they wanted to try to have, that somehow their great problems would be solved. Probably the economic problems would be solved by having some sort of great war. Now, the feeling I'm also getting from the cards is that, it's like beware of unintended consequences, because the cards seem to be suggesting that they think they're in control, that they may or may not get their war, but if they do get their war, it's going to get way out of control and probably will contribute to the wall. I mean, that's a guess of mine from what I'm sensing. And again, they may not get their great war this year, and that's actually was reflected in the 2012 reading, but you've got this buildup with a lot of things happening that are people oriented, and that it looks like in 2013, if those energy cards are correct, that probably if it happens, that's when they get their great war. But I think it really gets out of hand. I think and that would again sort of fit with some of the Nostradamus stuff, although the timing may be a little bit different.
Okay. Well, here's another question from forum member Green Meadow. Cliff has said that some of the beginnings of the global revolution will come out of Ireland. So given that you live in Ireland, what do you think of this? How do you think the Irish might contribute to the global revolution, and what might trigger them into action?
Well, there's two possibilities. There's the simple one that I'm not sure would lead to global revolution, that could certainly have problems for the European Union, which is that in Ireland has an unusual situation in that in all the other countries of the European Union, their parliaments or their legislatures can vote to change their treaties. But in Ireland, if any EU treaty changes the Irish constitution, which 99% of the changes do, the Irish by law have to vote on them at the public. And the only way to avoid that would be to essentially declare martial law, for lack of a better term, or just to try to ignore it, in which case people would in fact riot. However, the things Cliff seems to be suggesting are so strong that I don't really know. And as I said, I've been trying to get Cliff to talk about this himself for almost a year now. I've even stayed up to listen to Scottish Sovereign's interviews with him and asked him, and all we kept getting was that he didn't want to answer it because he was afraid of affecting the outcome. Now, since nothing that I obviously know of happened in September, I have put forth a question in the interview with him, and I don't know if it will be asked or not, but I hope it will be. If he could explain further now on that, since we're past September of 2011, because I myself would like to know, because I live here, is there any more information on what the webbots have? Because I can think of lots of things, but it's really just me speculating. And other than the EU thing, I don't know what makes Ireland specifically more ripe for revolution than anywhere else.
Well, maybe history. Small size.
But, okay, the Irish, though, the Irish have actually a history of taking and taking and taking and taking until they just explode. So that is possible. But I mean, for example, the Irish Revolution of 1916 was probably indirectly a reaction to the potato famine of the 1840s, but it took nearly 80 years to take place. And it didn't, because the Irish seem to be really good at hunkering down and having what I would think of as basically rebelling, but without doing it obviously. I mean, for example, they will put their, like right now, moonshining is becoming very popular again. Tax avoidance is becoming an art form again. When we first moved here, if you had work done for you, workmen asked for their checks to be made out to cash. That's happening again. In fact, the government has looked into trying to eliminate checks. And make checks. They haven't done it, but they've talked about it, because so much of the economy is the black economy. That is typical of the Irish way of rebelling. People think of the Irish are very, they like to get in fist fights and things, but when it actually comes to actually picking something on and doing something, yes, you have the situation in Northern Ireland, but that's a very different issue, although that could play into what Cliff is talking about. I mean, he doesn't make a distinction that I know of between the Republic and Northern Ireland, so perhaps things start to blow up there. I don't know. They've been relatively calm for years, but in general, except for that kind of political situation of trying to get rid of England and trying to be independent, again, largely because people were starving. My husband's business partner has told me that in 1916, basically what happened was is people were working 40-hour, 50-hour, 60-hour weeks and still not making enough money, and their children were starving to death. And finally, people just snapped. And they felt they didn't have anything left to lose, so they started shooting people. And that could be what happens again. I mean, if things got that dire, the Irish probably would, but I think it would take. That's why I want to know what Cliff has to say, because I don't know if that's what he's alluding to, or if it's something else.
Well, there's another angle I think that might be part of this, and that is the importance of the British aristocracy centered in the city of London, and just the historical relationship with Ireland. So, I mean, I think there's probably some visceral genetic history in the Irish about how they don't care for those people in the city of London. And that could be a symbol.
It could, but the other thing you have to remember is Ireland, in the current situation, really has two choices that I can see. They can either continue to ally themselves with the EU and essentially be subsumed into this big federalist state that they seem to be trying to be bent on trying to create, or they could take the other really political. That's not, people don't really want that, but equally people have this sort of visceral reaction to doing anything with the UK. But really their only other option at the moment, with the world having not completely disintegrated but being the way it is, will be for an economic, not a political, but an economic alliance with the UK, which they kind of used to have and did when we moved here. The punt was even called the pound unofficially. Everybody called it the pound, even though it was the punt. And a lot of Irish law is the same as English law, and a lot of, even though there's very much a that's them and this is us, there's still there was an awful lot of unofficial alliances there. Now, whether, and again, it may be that people explode simply because they can't deal with two unpalatable choices. Now, that wouldn't surprise me either, because there may be like, well, why do we have to go with the EU or England? We'd hate both of those options. So we're going to blow up. That could be it too.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Just don't know. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's fine. I think it's just we're discussing something that, how can we know? Global revolution. I mean, how would that play out? I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe Canada would be important in this. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it could be.
Could be.
I keep waiting for the Japanese since I live in Japan, but I think like the Irish, I think they're just going to blow up at some point.
Yeah, and I think that's a good. The Japanese and the Irish are very, very different, but I think they also have that tendency to take and take and take and take, and then maybe one day a pin drops and it's just too much.
Yeah, the question is it 2012 or when will we see it? But I think it's coming. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Plain. Next, we're going to move into the topic of changes in the future. And the next question is from Lua.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Melody. We're going from global revolution now into global earth changes. This is a question from forum member Green Meadow, and she'd like to know what you've seen about earth changes. Some think we are heading into an ice age. Others think we're heading into a time of increased geologic instability with earthquakes and volcanoes, maybe all of the above. And extreme weather certainly does seem to be on the rise. What can you tell us about what to expect?
My gut feeling is based partly on the snow and other in the wall dream, and also I had another dream a few years ago, not nearly as long ago, but maybe about 6 years ago now, where I was standing in San Francisco, and I used to live in San Francisco, and I was talking, or in the Bay Area, and I was talking to a friend of mine who used to be a member of my circle when I was there. And this young man looked like your stage Hollywood Indian. If you wanted somebody to play, the noble savage, he would be it. He's actually Pomo. And his grandfather actually is a medicine elder. And but anyway, in the dream, he was standing there with his long black hair whipping behind him, dressed in traditionals. And he said, "The great winter is coming. We have to get out of here."
Oh, my. Okay.
Now, at that point, one of my teachers is another Native American elder who taught me helped me learn trance work and a lot of things. And I went to him and I said, I described this dream, and he said, traditionally, the great winter to a Native person would usually mean either the worst winter that an elder himself could remember, say somebody in their 80s or 90s, or that he had heard described to him as a child as the worst thing an elder in their 80s or 90s had seen. So probably the worst winter at between 100 and 100, between 80 and 150 years. He said it could be more than that, but that would be the main traditional view. And he said, and then I waited, and the next year it wasn't bad. I mean, okay. So obviously I have a file in my head that I call interesting, and I just filed the dream in interesting, but it was very, very real. It had what I call the marks of a true dream. A true dream does not necessarily mean that everything in it is going to happen the way you dream it, but it means that the message is there. And one of the marks is this, for me, is this technicolor, very real sense, a sense of power, and that to wake up just shivering or shaking, and that all happened with this. Mm-hmm. So I put it in interesting for a while, and then things started changing. We got wild weather swings. We had some really hot summers here in Ireland, and then it started gradually getting weirder throughout the world. And then the last 2 years, in the north anyway, have been extremely cold. And my personal view, because if you look at the ice core ratings and things, they're now finding that ice ages are almost always preceded by global warming spikes. That there isn't a one that wasn't. So the two ideas are not mutually exclusive. And I suspect that if we're not actually headed towards a regular ice age, like a full-blown, 20,000 years under the ice thing, I think that we are at least approaching a similar situation to what happened at the end of the Middle Ages, where they have what's called the modern minimum. And the modern minimum is actually brought such horrible weather in the 14th century, just horrible disasters for food and other things, that people thought before the plague came, they thought that God hated them. And then the Black Plague came, partly probably as a result of that climate change. Now, climate change is a really overused word, but historically it really is very important. And like I said, for example, the last 2 years in Ireland, we've had massive snow for here, cold, ice. And we were really expecting that with the rune readings, but what we got was massive flooding. And so I think that the violent weather, probably ending on the cold side, at least for the Northern Hemisphere, is probably going to occur the next few years. I'm also getting a very strong sense, and have for many years, of eventual earth changes or earthquakes, but the timing is really difficult. I mean, and some things you just don't know. Like I had a dream that I actually, the first time I contacted John Hogue, was standing in a parking lot in front of Vesuvius, and I have been to Vesuvius, and I have been to Pompeii, and I'm just standing there looking at the mountain, and this young man with very jocular, very kind of fun-loving, looked at me with this kind of smirk on his face, and he said, poor buggers, they didn't have a chance the last time, they won't the next time either. Ha ha ha. Huh. And I mean, I know that was Loki. In my cosmology, yeah. That's Loki. And he was just, Loki isn't necessarily a bad figure, but he's a trickster. Yeah. So, I mean, and what I told John, obviously we all know Pompeii, I mean, we all know Vesuvius is going to explode again, but does this mean it's going to be in my lifetime? I don't know. But it was definitely a true dream. And I was like, okay, I hope they can finish excavating before the next one. Mm-hmm. And I hope they can get people out of here, because if you've ever been to the area, to Naples, you know that there's like millions of people just packed in this little area, and there'd be no way to get them out if it happened suddenly. Mm-hmm. But again, that's just a dream on interesting, but there's no time on it. And I also have a feeling that the New Madrid, more specifically, I've had a feeling for several years that the New Madrid fault line was waking up, and I think that's starting to be borne out. But again, as to when, don't have timing exactly, but looking at that reading 2013, 2014 in there would not surprise me, at least to have some quakes, and that could be really, really dangerous, because they're not, that area, unlike California, that area is not built for earthquakes. There just isn't. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the weather's definitely showing up in runes and in dreams and in cards. And remember, the great winter is coming, or so says a certain Pomo Indian in my dreams.
So basically what you're saying is all of the above.
Yeah. and probably I think the whole idea the planet's getting too hot and we're going to all die in a giant pressure. John Hogan and I disagree on this, by the way, but I think that rather than a giant pressure cooker, we're much more likely to freeze. But it could get warmer before it gets colder, but it does seem to actually be, I think the severe winters are going to be an issue for some time.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Lua. Next up, we have Uranus Rising.
Melodi, you were speaking earlier about your dream and about life back in the 1800s. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about why you see this. And maybe it might be a good idea if you could talk to us about what life might be like, so we might get used to it.
Okay, I wrote this down. I'm going to kind of read it because I had to really think about this one. And I said it's probably a mixture of late 1880s life, basically fairly civilized but without electrical power, with some spots of electricity and other modern things provided locally. Now, that would be different than what you had in the actual 1880s. As someone once said, history doesn't actually repeat, but sometimes it rhymes, and I think that's what's maybe going on here. Life would be much more local, but you wouldn't if it were like the 1880s, you wouldn't be without international contact. But letters would take weeks or months to go across the Atlantic, and goods might take a year to go by sailing ship around the world if there wasn't enough oil to run big modern engines. Again, you might have a few modern ships still going, but they wouldn't be necessarily used for regular trade and transport. Phones would probably exist. They did in the late 1880s, but like electricity, they'd be limited to the very wealthy or the very lucky. A new thing might be radio, might continue, especially short wave, as would possibly even the internet in places, but by and large, the people you see every day will be your social connections. Travel would be much harder. Trains might exist in some places, but off the main lines, you'd be back the same way Ireland was during World War II. Ireland was effectively thrown back into the 19th century, and people went back to using carts and bicycles and got their buggies out, which hadn't been put away that long, because people just couldn't buy gasoline. So you have films of 1940s Dublin when people, going to in carriage taxis, and I just have a similar thing happen to that in Ireland, which I just said. So that's I think that gives you sort of a handle. I think it will be a mixture of things. If that's actually what happens, if that's an accurate reading, that would be kind of, I think, what you would find.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite interested in this. And you have a lot of skills as far as old crafts and clothing, textiles. I know you spin and weave. What do you see as being the most important skills that we could relearn, and why you think this would be necessary or helpful? What would be the most important things we should relearn?
Okay, well, I think there are several things, and I think there's what I call first stage and second stage survival tips. And your first stage, you can get on a lot of good websites, and they include things like just knowing how to save water in rain barrels, or find water in your local area. Because water, you can't live without more than 3 days. So we're going to assume that people already are aware that they probably want to at least have, the classic, some water saved up, some basic food saved up. But long-term skills, what I call second stage preparations, or even third stage for long-term, if life goes back to the 1880s or even becomes less comfortable than it is now, say serious Great Depression time.
Right.
I have a list here. Your food production and preservation. This would include gardening, cooking, preserving, hunting, butchering, drying, smoking, canning, making cheese, making bread. Not to scare people, you don't learn all this all at once. And as I tell people, even if you learn to do one or two things and start out, you're going to be way ahead of 99% of the other people. Because to me, the 99% are actually the 99% of people who aren't going to have learned anything. And you're one step ahead the more you get of this list. Okay, then also related to these crafts would be things like making soap, making lye even from ashes, candle making, building fires, etc. basic herb skills, how to identify them as well as to use them. I fall down here. My husband is actually the herbalist in the family, and he's always teasing me because he said, "Here, you're supposed to be all this witchy stuff, and to you, a herb comes in a bottle." Because he's right. He's right. I mean, he goes out and he grows all this stuff in the garden, and I'm like, it's a pretty plant.
Yeah.
What is this? But in actuality, in all seriousness, I have learned to identify a few of them, because if he's not there, I won't know if, I actually planted garlic upside down, which I gather is a fairly common thing to do. But this is the kind of thing, things are good. Well, things have not gone bad. Learning, for example, just the most simple gardening skills and planting your garlic upside down, get that out of the way, because you want to do that when there's a book called Gardening When It Counts, and I have a thing about, I reverse that and say, you want to garden when it doesn't count, so you can order pizza when you need to. Because in the long term, when it does count is not when you want to be learning everything on your feet. So, even grow a few plants on your windowsill, because you're going to learn a lot of things. Textile crafts that you are and related things like leather work, keeps you warm, and how to stay warm or how to stay cold depending on your climate. Also, it's a great hobby, if you can sew, if you can spin, if you can weave, if you can knit, because it's a great hobby in good times, so you can make gifts for all your friends and have something to do with your hands. But it's actually an important survival skill. And I actually, I can put the link up on the, if we want to later, but I have a small blog called Back to the Dark Ages. It was part of a radio show that really isn't much ongoing, but it basically has a few pages on why these things are important and resources that you can get to learn about some of these things. I've got also, in addition to basic gardening, if you can, learn anything you can about livestock animals, especially backyard animals like chickens, pigs, goats. I don't have goats because they eat gardens, but if you live in a suburb or something where you can't have anything, even if you just have pets, observe them, learn how they are, and then read as much as you can, because understanding and gaining some experience, even if it's over a weekend visiting a farm, again, will put you one step ahead of all the other people who don't even know that sheep can be really big and they can hurt you if you don't know that. You don't just walk into a pen of sheep and say, "Hi, I'm the shepherd." They can run you over. They can send you to the doctor. So, if you go and stay on a farm for a weekend, you're going to get some of this information. And finally, the most important thing I think you can do is study your local area and learn what traditional people in your area used to do to keep warm, put food on the table, did for transport, how they built houses. Because if things get really, really grim, you can modify what they did, and probably it will be easier to meet your needs. And that's going to be, again, that's back to that whole local thing, because like in Ireland, for example, people traditionally did things with salt preserving and smoke and root cellars and things, and even the root cellars were dodgy because the climate just didn't allow for things like drying unless it was in a fireplace. And that's just one example, that you want to be local, and you can look at both ancient people, like if you're in North America, look at what the Native Americans did, and also what the pioneers did in your area, and you'll get a much better feel of what works and what doesn't.
Well, that's a very, very wise approach to it. One of the other things that I think from listening to you might be helpful is be around people that know skills as well, so you don't have to learn them all.
Well, exactly. Nobody knows how to do everything. And one of the best ways, I forgot to put this on the list, but one of the best ways you can learn skills, if you have any interest at all and have any free time, is to either join or make friends with or visit any of the numerous types of historic reenactors. Whether it's the Society for Creative Anachronism, whether it's that does sort of Middle Ages, whether it's Vikings, whether it's rendezvous or people doing the powwows, or people doing powwows are actually often real. So maybe I'm trying to think of I've drawn a blank on it, but there's a group. The Voyageurs are people who do 18th century reenactment on the East Coast, and then there's people in Buckskinners. That's it. There's people doing 19th century in the West. All of these groups of people often do public demonstrations. They're often more than happy to share with you how to cook over an open fire, how to use cast iron. If they're Vikings, how to set a fire with flint and steel, how to use a loom, these kind of things. And they're not only really good people to get to know, but you can have a lot of fun too. And whether you have the time to get really interested and want to learn how to make costumes and everything and go out and join them, or whether you're just kind of dropping in. George Uri actually has talked about being being around the local SCA, which is the group I'm in Texas, and how much fun it is to go and occasionally drop in and pretend you're in. The SCA is different because they actually do anything that's pre-1600. It's more of a club, but there's being able to just go and spend a weekend and watch people do things the old way. And then you're going to find people that specialize in different techniques and things. And that's really the fun way to do it. There are other ways, of course. There's just like quilting clubs or clubs that are dedicated to like backpacking or camping, and was another good way of going at it. But I like the historical reenactment route myself.
Yeah. And also I would love to see the art of craft come back. I think we've lost a lot by doing that. And I know you and I have even talked about just sitting there knitting, that can put you in a trance state. And so you never know what gifts we might resurrect here.
Spinning is brilliant for that. Spinning is probably of the traditional textile crafts, that's the one that it's almost impossible not to go into trance if you have a tendency to do that.
Yeah.
So just be careful where you spin.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Melody. That's quite helpful.
Certainly.
Thanks, Uranus Rising. And now we will hear from Plain again.
Okay. Do you have any advice for newcomers to the whole unseen world? Your exercises in Chapter 1 of your book looked like a good start.
Yes, I would say one of the most important things is to try to stay grounded, because there's a real tendency, and I write about this in the chapter, especially if you experience things for the first time and they're really out of your realm of experience, to become kind of disconnected and get so interested in the unseen world that we kind of forget about the seen world, or the world we usually live in. And I think that's really important. That whole idea of grounding, and the tree exercise that I have in the book is really a big part of that, where you imagine yourself as a tree rooted to the earth, and then you bring up energy from the earth and renew yourself with it. You stay connected, because that is really, I think, the biggest problem that a lot of people have. Even if they start out as a fairly grounded person, it's very easy to get kind of off in going 1,000 different directions, when you've got to realize that you still have to live in this world, as well as the unseen world is going to be there. It's always been there. You just haven't been as aware of it. It's not going to go anywhere. So, try to stay grounded in this one as well.
I hear that so often about the importance of staying grounded, but I think a lot of people have a lot of trouble with it, and so maybe you could give a couple of other suggestions if you have any.
Well, I find for myself that when I feel like I'm getting out there, and that happens quite a bit, especially like for several days after I've had one of these dreams. And when we first got married, my husband thought I had them every day, and actually I can go for a year without having them, and then I might have 3 fairly close together. By the third one, I am like really out there myself, and I find things that help are actual good hands-on distractions. Now, this is probably because I am a very craft-oriented person, but I will go and I will, set up a complicated pattern on my loom, or I will just go make dinner for my family. Maybe I'll deliberately cook something rather complicated that takes a lot of concentration. Digging in the earth and working in the garden are other good ways traditionally to do this, because even if, like with the spinning, even if you get a little bit trancy, at least it's focused on making yarn, or it's focused on making dinner, which you are then going to eat, or it's focused on digging in the ground and getting that plant and paying attention. Another really good way for people with animals is to just go talk to your pets, because believe me, they are grounded all the time. To cats in particular, and I'm particularly a cat person, but dogs as well. The cats, they see the other world. They know what's going on, but their food bowl is the most important thing. I mean, you're important too, and so is being petted, but they have their priorities. In fact, I've actually joked about writing another book called the way of the food bowl, the spiritual path of the cat, because that's really much it. And, the cat-centered universe is it's all about me. Now, taken to extremes, that is obviously a problem. But when you're in this kind of diffuse state, you do want to pull it back and think about you as a human body in this world, because we're here for a reason. If we didn't want to be here on some level or didn't need to be here, we'd just stay in spirit all the time and we wouldn't bother to incarnate. But like I said, on a practical level, even, go out and have fun sometimes too. I mean, go interacting with people finally. So it's interact with pets and then finally interact with other human beings, because nothing will ground you faster than like going and having to have a conversation with somebody, particularly if you're not talking about your past lives in Atlantis, but go and talk to somebody like your parent or your sister or someone that is just, a good friend, but on a totally different topic, because it will bring you back into the world fairly quickly, usually. What you don't want to do, and I talk about this in the book too, is you don't want to, when you're in this kind of state, you don't want to ping off of other people who are also new, just like you are, and who are so excited that we're going to get, oh, wow, we're going to talk about everything cosmic, because that can just pull everybody kind of off track. But in general, again, work with your hands, talk to your animals, talk to people, and make things or do things, whatever that is. And sometimes even just mundane work, concentrate on what you have to do here. And you may have to force yourself to do that at first, but once you're actively involved in that job or that experience, you'll come back down to earth pretty quickly, usually.
That sounds good. Now I need to get the Japanese novel "I Am a Cat" out of my head. You've got me off in Catland here. Okay, well, thanks for that. Now, I have a question. If you've got any suggestions on how someone could find a good card or rune reader in their neck of the woods, and then hopefully avoid the bad ones or the ones who aren't so good. Any suggestions on that?
Oh, definitely. And this is one case where references, referrals, and personal experiences are going to save you a lot of time and money if you can. Most places, even Ireland has one, have something like the Irish one is called the Paranormal Board. There's a lot of forums and things where they're often like part of local community sites where you can go, and if nothing else, you can just say, I heard about so-and-so. What is anybody's experiences? Now, sometimes, like on the Irish board, sometimes they get a little bit brutal, and I just ignore that, because any psychic can have a good day or a bad day. But if you don't have any other choices, you can go on forums. Much better than that is talking to other friends or other people. Even asking the psychic themselves for references. If they're a good one, they won't mind giving you references to people you can talk to. A lot of people have testimonials on their sites. I'm going to be putting some up, but again, you have to take those with a grain of salt because you don't know who's actually making them. Same thing with psychic hotlines and stuff. Some of them are very, very good. Planet Stars, I know that because I've worked with them. They actually vet everybody. But I've also run into, there was one company who I shall not name that when I was first doing this, I wanted to apply at. And they had this was back when the internet was still fairly new and they didn't have a lot of security. And there was a part on the site that I was going to apply for that said for readers only for people that work there. And I clicked and I got there. And basically they had instructions on how to fake a reading. I mean, right there, exactly 1, 2, 3, 4. This is how you fake a reading. And I was just appalled. And so you never know when you're calling one of these places. Again, unless you talk to people first and get a reference, you don't know what they're going to be like at all. So that's really that. And the other thing you can kind of do is read the person's website if they have one, read a book if they have one out there, listen to interviews if there's interviews with them. You can often get a sense of things. I mean, if you like what you hear and you feel like you might be compatible with them, then, you contact them and find out, ask about them. Another thing you can go by, unless they are incredibly famous, this is just a personal thing with me. Unless they are so famous that they're actually trying to discourage people because they're human beings and they're too overwhelmed. The pricing system, when Edgar Casey was first started doing his readings, he was a family man and he'd been a photographer. And he started doing more and more reading because more and more people were asking for them and he wasn't charging anything. And finally, this young wife came and said that if he really felt he needed to do this, that he could continue but she was going to have to take the children and go home to mother because they didn't have any food and the kids were hungry. So he either needed to go back to doing photography or he had to figure out a way to support them, because back then, women just didn't go out and get jobs. This was like in the early 20th century in general. And so what Edgar Cayce did is he meditated on it for a while. And at that time, about $2 an hour was about the price of a regular doctor's visit. And since he was mostly doing health readings, he decided that was a good judge. So he started charging $2 an hour, with often doing, readings for free for people who really couldn't afford it, quietly. And I found that to be a pretty good rule of thumb. If a reader charges, or somebody doing ghost busting or anybody like that charges you much more than a regular GP visit would be, I would think twice about it, unless, of course, like I said, they're just so very famous that they really can only take 500 readings a year, and they're trying to cut down on them. And most of those people, if they are honest, good readers, will also quietly be doing free pro bono work on the side. I mean, every reader I know that is, again, that's another thing to look for too. Do they occasionally do volunteer work? Do they seem to be in it just for the money? Or are they actually interested in helping people? And that's another one you can go by. So again, pricing, references, and above all, looking at what they have written, what they have said, and maybe even talking to them personally. Again, a good reader, I don't mind. I can't spend all day talking to a potential client, but I'm happy to talk to people for 15 minutes, half an hour, even sometimes, so they get a feel of me and who I am, and if I'm the right match for them, and if I'm not. And there are things that I don't do. For example, I'm not a professional medium. I actually do have some mediumship abilities, but I just don't feel that's something I want to do as part of my professional practice. So I keep a list of people that are recommended to me by people who've had good experiences, who are mediums, and I have a list of them and phone numbers. And there are a number of other things that if I don't feel I'm the right person, I'll refer them. And that's another clue. If this person's not willing to refer you to somebody else, then again, that's kind of a red flag, because it kind of means that maybe they're a little more interested in getting your money than getting the right match. So I hope that helps.
Oh, no, that's definitely helpful. That puts everyone on the right path. One last question from me. Are there any cards or techniques that you feel are too dangerous or dark for the average person? So perhaps the Ouija board or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that are probably not better played around with when you first start. I don't like Ouija boards in particular because they come with a lot of baggage, and they're on the edge of mediumship without any protections. Again, when you start dealing with possibly outside entities, whether they're the dead or whether they're demi-fae or whether they're gods or however you perceive them, you're opening yourself up. It's like opening up a telephone, and you're not really sure who's on the other end. In my opinion, you need to do this, including channeling would also be in this category. It's much safer to do this with people, if you're going to do them, people who are experienced, people who know how to provide psychic safety for others as well as themselves, people who know how to guard and ward an area, and people who can help you get out of trouble if you get into it. And because Ouija boards are kind of just done like a game, they tend to, particularly by teenagers, they tend to be opening up all this stuff without any necessarily a way to close it off. And so I really don't recommend them for that reason. But pendulums are fairly safe. Serious magic is another one you really want to avoid without training. My husband was originally trained as a ritual magician, and there's a big difference between religion and mysticism and magic. And one of the differences is if you're asking the universe, spirit, or a deity or your spirit guide for help with something, it's almost in a way like a prayer or assisted prayer. And that's very safe, because if you make a mistake, presumably an answer can be no, and that's just how it is. And the universe will, if you have a good intention, it's probably going to be all right. But when you start getting into ritual magic, if you make a mistake, sometimes all the good intentions in the world can't stop you from getting hurt, either physically or psychically or both. And the same thing I think is true with playing around with channeling or mediumship without a trained person to supervise. because you can get in the same kind of problems. It doesn't matter how well intentioned you are. If something icky gets its hold on you and you don't know how to get out of it, it can be mentally, not necessarily physically damaging, but mentally quite damaging. On the other hand, other safe things are dreaming, or what they call intended dreaming, where you practice before you go to bed at night, saying, I want to dream about my past life, or I want to dream that have control when I'm in my dream. I want to be aware that I'm dreaming. Those things are perfectly safe to do on your own or with a book. Guided meditations are pretty safe. You can do them on your own by doing them into a recording device and then playing them back while you meditate. A guided meditation can also be done with a friend. If you sit down and write it down or get one from a good book, have them read it to you. Sometimes if you don't have anybody to train with, getting together with another friend who's also interested and doing the safe things like the guided meditations is a really good place to start, because then you can talk to each other. But you're probably not, as long as you stay away from the really dicey stuff, you're probably going to be okay. And finally, past life regressions are probably best done with a trained person, at least at first, though you can do fairly safe ones with your own dreams, of course, are almost always safe. And private meditation, again, if you want to do your own past life regression, recording it first, or there's a number of good recordings out there that can take you through it. The FAR memory cards that I use, which have recently come out, that deck is perfectly safe and a great way to get your feet wet in experiencing or looking at possible past incarnations in a perfectly safe way. But your actual full past life regression, because it involves trance, again, you probably want somebody doing that knows how to get you in and get you out. And I would say the same thing for shamanic stuff, which I'm also trained in. There's an awful lot of drumming circles and things around, and some of them are really, really good, but some of them are just a bunch of people sitting around not really knowing what they're doing, chanting and beating on drums. And because, again, if they're not properly warded, if they're not properly set up, you can attract all kinds of things. You just want to make sure the person leading them at least has some idea of what they're doing. They may or may not actually be trained in a specific tradition, although it's better if they are. But if they aren't, but at least they have basic sort of unseen world type of understanding, so that they know that when they're taking people into trance and doing the drumming and the chanting and the dancing, they know how to bring them back out again and make sure everybody's home safe. So that's probably the big ones there.
Sounds good. So thanks, Melody. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Thanks, Plain. And next up, we have Lua.
Okay, this is another question from forum members. It's a combined question from Diane VG, Ma'am, Green Meadow, and me. One forum member states, quote, I have been having an odd feeling lately where many things that I used to follow with great interest now seem meaningless. It almost feels as if we're shifting into a new dimension or paradigm where politics, economics, and doom scenarios are not relevant. Some people are calling this doom fatigue, end quote. And then another member has said, quote, some of the new agers are claiming that the planet has already undergone a vibrational change and that humans are in the process of either managing to adjust to this change or fading out, dying in other words, because they cannot change with the planet, end quote. What's your feeling, or what do your readings say about whether there are such changes? Like, do you see, as some people say, that the frequency of people experiencing other or parallel dimensions is increasing? And do you see people physically or psychically moving into other dimensions or astral traveling?
Okay, several things first, and I may ask you to remind me if I got lost here. On my notes, what I have is, first thing, doom fatigue is really real. And when that can happen, it just usually means it's time to take a break. It's very similar. You do the same things very similarly to you do if you're having trouble grounding. Only in this case, you want to rest and relaxation. One of the cards of the Psychic Tarot deck is the rest and relaxation and meditation card. And it really is important. Sometimes we just need to take a step back and go do whatever we find is fun, whether that's going to see a comedy show, whether that is, cooking breakfast, or whether that is like running around, playing tag with our kids. It's still, it's a time to take a break and step back, because no one can deal with this stuff all the time. I have I'm not really sure if I personally the idea of the world vibrations will change doesn't really resonate with me. Some people I really really, really respect, do believe this. And it's another one of those things I put in that file cabinet called interesting in my brain, because I just don't know. But I do know, because I'm really interested in like anthropology, history, and archaeology, that in general, people themselves, individual peoples can change, and we hope that that happens along your spiritual path. But human nature and people in general don't seem to change very much, just their technology and their situations change. And I think it's probably more likely people have to adapt to a new lifestyle, but you'd still have to deal with the same human baggage they always have in the sense. So, I mean, I don't really feel that some great beam is going to come down from the sky and change human nature, and all the icky people will go away somewhere, possibly die, possibly like go off planet, or there'll be a totally new planet where only the good people will be. For one thing, that's very, very close to the kind of mythos you get in almost all societies, that someday there's going to be this golden age. Now, I could be wrong. I mean, I'd love to live in utopia, but my guess is it's more that another lesson of the human condition is going to have to be learned, and that is how to survive and cope. And possibly what will happen is we'll have to learn once again how to live locally and more in a tribal situation than we currently do. So no, I don't think the world itself is going to change, but it could. And I know there are many people who disagree with that. As for traveling, either physically between dimensions or astrally, I'm absolutely convinced that astrally it happens quite frequently and almost all the time. Because I myself, I think we do this a lot in dreams. I think some of my real dreams, some of them appear to be going into the other world, as in where people go when they die. Others appear to be going to other dimensions. And I've even personally had the experience of what I felt was some very real time travel in my own dreams. So and possibly that was also astral as well. I don't tend to have it happen in as much in visionary waking experiences. There have been a couple of times when I've wondered, but for me, it's always been a sort of spiritual experience. On the other hand, there's some very intriguing stories, and I actually went and looked this one up and put it in my notes. There's the story of the Green Children of Woolpit in England, which is from the 12th century, and it is a story that was repeated by, I believe it was a priest, and he's simply writing about things that he experienced while traveling from parish to parish. And one of the things that makes it so believable is it's not particularly done as anything sensational. It's just a report. And it's a report of two children, a boy and his sister with green-tinged skin, were found at the mouth of a cave called the Wolf Pits. And when first discovered, they were both extremely frightened, and no one could understand their speech. They were eventually taken to the home of the local lord, and they would not eat normal food. They were both obviously very hungry until several days later they were given some bean stalks. And when they were shown how to get the beans out, they just fell on them really, really hungry. Basically what happened was that then they started eating. Their skin began to turn regular colors once they started eating, as they ate more regular food. The boy remained really depressed and died of an illness fairly early on. The girl remained in good health, and she lost her green coloring. She was baptized and stayed in service to the house of the local lord. When she learned to speak English, she related the story of how they had come to be at the entrance to the pits. She said she had come from a land where there is no sun, but light such as our twilight all the time. She and her brother were following their flocks of animals when they chanced into the cave. They entered the cave, heard the sound of bells, probably the church bells presumably, heard the music and followed it, and wound up in the 12th century in England. There's two versions of the story, but they're both from around the same area. Now, that one has always struck me as being the most likely case of people actually maybe physically walking through dimensions of any of the modern ones I've read, simply because if you read a lot of medieval chronicles, you'll know that the way they write about some things is very fantastical, but the way they write about just really mundane events is others. And this is just written down as something interesting. And where did those children come from? We don't know. Was the story made up? Possibly, but it doesn't have the elements of the kind of things you got from made-up stories from the time. So I'd say it can happen, but I don't know that it happens very often. And whether it's happening more now, I don't know. But I think definitely with the internet, if it does happen, we're more likely to be made aware of it. because the internet has made such tremendous changes in how people can find information. Like, I first read about the Green Children of Woolpit when I was a child, in a book my father had, but I would have had to go to the library and look it up even 20 years ago, and now I can just turn online, and that's what I just read was mostly from a webpage called the Green Children of Woolpit that I can post link to, that are on Legends. It says Mysterious Britain in England, a website. So anyway, that's my answer to that one.
Can you spell that? Green Children of what?
Yeah. It's the Green Children of Woolpit, Woolpit.
Okay.
And the story was told by medieval writers Ralph of Cargsdale and William of Newbridge, and it's south of England, 12th century. So that gives you, great.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Sure.
I have another question for you that
Sure.
came out. You said something about farm memory cards. What are those?
They're a new deck of cards, and I'll try to put up links to them. I found them on Amazon when I was setting the business up, and thought, these look cool. I really thought they would be more of a parlor game, but they actually turn out to be, they're obviously created by a couple who are in their 80s now. He was a World War II fighter pilot. And their book is almost unintelligible. If you haven't done a lot of reading of Edgar Cayce, their book will be unintelligible. But you can forget the book and throw it out because it's interesting, but it's very theoretical. But the cards themselves, basically, you have like a card for time, civilization, a card for life path or theme, a card for location, and different things that basically, so you can get an idea of where you supposedly lived, what you supposedly did for a living, what your major life lesson was, and how you died. And this
really?
And actually, I have found them with people to be amazingly accurate. They have problems. For example, obviously are using a lot of the Cayce stuff, and a lot of the people that came to Cayce were from the same places. You'd expect that because karmic clumps are going to come and ask questions. So there's no card for North America. There's a card for South America and Central America, but there's no card for North America.
Huh.
There's no the time is like you get Egypt. Okay, what time? I actually started using the pendulum because they suggested using a pendulum, and I'll sit there and go, it'll say prehistoric, and I just had one of those readings, and I have to go Old Stone Age, New Stone Age. Are we in the Neolithic? Are we in the Mesolithic? Are we? So I mean, I would love to, if I could draw, I would love to do my own set of these that would include some of what I think of as the missing cards. But still, given what they are just brilliant. And I mean, I've had people, I did one for a client recently, about a week ago, and she was saying that, because the cards were like, she was in in India and blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And it was all exactly the same thing that a person had told her. When she had a past life reading a few months before. So now I'm using them again as a focus. I'm learning the best way to use them I have found is in private readings where I can feel comfortable going into very light trance. And again, I'm using the cards as a focus, and I'm sort of doing a past life reading without being like going into full trance to do it. Okay, but even in public, they work really well.
Okay.
Sorry, I keep rambling on there.
No, that's all right.
I can send you the link on Amazon. They're great to get and play with.
Yeah, I'd like that. Okay.
Melody, I have a question for you, if you're finished, Lua.
Yeah, sure. I am.
My aunt is psychic, and she's always read with regular playing cards, and she made me a set. Of course, I don't feel comfortable with them because I don't do that kind of thing. I've never read cards. What do you think of that, or do you know anyone who does that?
Yeah, actually, there is a lot of, originally tarot cards were playing cards, and nobody really knows when they morphed into starting to be used for fortune telling. But my comment to my husband when this came up was, well, lots of people, particularly in Ireland or in other places that traditionally where people are quite poor and where you could never find a set of, you couldn't afford something like tarot cards, and if you've heard of them, people tell fortunes with playing cards. There's several people that do it at the psychic fairs I go to. And there's even a deck now that you can get that's like a tarot deck, only it's the playing card fortune telling deck, which I just can't get my head around. But basically and there's one of the people that goes on Coast to Coast who actually seems pretty accurate. I can't remember who it is, but one of the regular psychic guests reads playing cards rather than tarot cards. So it's a very old concept.
Oh, okay. No, she had given me a deck, and it's only used for that. And then she had written on each one what they mean, and they're kind of interesting. And every so often, I'll pull one out to see if it resonates for the day, but I haven't done that in a while. And then the second question I had for you. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, what you might
Just
want to do, though, you
interview
might feel
after
more
the interview.
comfortable getting something like what they call oracular cards now, which would be like something like the Psy card deck or the Psychic Tarot, one of the ones that has the pictures and the word on it and is not necessarily, may or may not be connected to traditional tarot or playing cards, because they can be a little easier with just the one word in the picture to sort of see what it means for you if you're first learning to read.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the second question I had is I love to comb used bookstores and things like that. And every so often I'll see a tarot deck in there with the thing, with the, book explaining what it means. But I've always been hesitant to pick it up just because of the energies that may be on it. How do you feel about that? Or is there a way that I should cleanse it?
There are ways you can cleanse it. In general, I mean, there are different attitudes. My husband that comes from ritual magic won't even touch a deck of cards until I've opened it and touched it, because apparently that's traditional. I'm fine with that. I just do it. On the other hand, there's also traditions about people giving you, your first deck should be given to you by somebody, which I don't think has to happen either. But often it's a deck somebody may have used. What you want to do, if you really, really, it's better if you can get a new deck. But if the only deck you can have is one that's been used, or like if one is passed down to you, what you can do is the same thing that I had one of my students do. My high priest, when I was in the Castro, he passed away from AIDS. And one of the things he passed on in his will was his set of runes to one of my students. And what we did was we soaked, because they were stones, and that it wouldn't suffer, we actually put them in salt water and soaked them for about 3 days in salt water, and that to cleanse them. And then we dried them out and we smudged them with, I think, some sage, basically earth, air, fire, water, and then they became cleared. You can do this with cards in a similar way by, setting them aside for a while, maybe putting them in some salt, or putting the box they're in some salt, and then other things that are cleansing, like maybe some incense over it. There are a lot of different ways of doing it. Basically, what you want to do is you want to clear the energies off, and that can be. Now, if something feels really icky, you probably just don't want to use it, because if it's really icky, something may have happened, or it may have been misused, and it's just not worth dealing with. But in general, if it's just like got somebody else's sort of vibes on it, for lack of a better term, just cleanse it that way and put it aside for a while in some salt or earth or something that's absorbing, and then reconsecrate it to you. And that can be done with just about any tool. That's true, probably any magical tool.
Okay. Yeah, I came across an I Ching in a bookstore that had been used, and it just felt, like you said, icky to me, and I didn't fiddle with it. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Melody. And in the beginning of the interview, you had done some mini readings, and I wanted to know if there was anything else you would care to add to that, or if you had anything more to share.
Yeah, I actually did a couple more readings, and one of the more promising ones I did that can be not quite so doomy as the first two is the next question was, what are the most beneficial things for individuals to concentrate on in the coming year 2012? I got some really positive cards on this. The first card is Now, which not only gives us a time marker, but the picture on it is of a man harvesting the wheat with the sun shining, and it's autumnal, and it's very much this time of year, and it's just very hopeful. It's very much fruitfulness and things. And the second card was Father, which is the man teaching his young son how to hunt with a bow and arrow. He's teaching him skills. He's also putting him forward in the way he should go. And the third is the Moon, which is dreams and things coming to fulfillment, things coming out of the depths. And also it is for intuition. And the way I read these cards is they suggest that the best things that people can do in order to ready themselves for the next couple of years are to now. That's a Now card. Start looking towards the future. The father pointing his son in the way he should go, learning skills, the father teaching his son to hunt, to care for himself, to take care of things. Also, the need to be open to their intuitive inner voice, which is the moon, for understanding what is their own best direction and goals, as well as being alerted to things coming up from the depths, that things that we can't see coming, but they're hidden and they're coming to being in the next year or two. The moon card is also the card of dreams and visions, the unseen world in general. So I think the basic message here is now, right now is the time to work on both practical skills, material situation. Keep your sense open to messages and information that come from that other world, as well as your intuition. The other world may be seen as your own inner voice, direction from spirit, your guardian angel, or even an inner hunch. But whatever it is, don't be so caught up in the material skills aspect of providing for yourself and taking care of things and being too bound in this world. You need to be aware and ready for anything that may be coming so that you don't lose touch with your inner voice, instructor. We're all going to need some of both. So again, you want balance. You want to be getting ready and learning skills and preparing as you can, but also listening to your inner direction and also direction from the divine, essentially.
Thank you, Melody. And we appreciate you sharing your knowledge and gifts with us this evening. And I will leave you with a poem by Martin Turner at tarotpoems.com relative to the Hermit card. The looker sees a light hidden in the dark. The seeker goes within, nurturing the spark. The asker hears a voice, speaking deeper wisdom. The seer finds a way of living with the vision. On behalf of Fox and all of the members of the WebBot Forum, thank you. And in our tradition of loving and making pie, may you and yours have many delicious pies to look forward to.
Thank you very much.